I'm going to give you an overview of immune senescence and look at some of the challenges, but I'm by no means an expert at this stage, and I certainly am very interested in the whole idea of the challenges of vaccinating older people. So there are more and more older people in the world. The global population is aging. We live longer, and the longer we live, the more old people there are accumulating in the world. These are some of the figures here, and they're quite impressive. And this is happening very fast nowadays. It's really a triumph of good health care, but cleaner, better environments, clean water, better nutrition, better food production, and so on. But it also, of course, imposes challenges on us because we're looking at a population which is increasingly aging, and there are still a lot of issues about the situation of being older. Aging we always associate with, to some extent, with decrepitude, and that's exactly what we don't want. We don't want longer lives with the same period of time towards the end of the life. We're all used to the idea that at the end of life there is often a period of time when people are unwell. And the aim has to be not just to have longer lives, but to keep that time of life very, very much in control and reduced. In other words, reduce those threats to a healthy life as people get older. And that's more challenging. It's more challenging to try and maintain health into older age, and it's intuitive. We know that. We know that older people are more likely to become unwell and are more likely to have severe illness when they do. So it raises issues about healthy aging and quality versus quantity of life. Infectious diseases contribute very significantly to morbidity and mortality, and more so in the extremes of life, so in the very young and in older people. And for much the same reason, in the young, the immune system is not fully functional, if you like, and in older people, it's beginning to age. And again, that doesn't surprise us. Older people can't run as fast as younger ones or jump as high, and that doesn't come as a surprise to us. They lose muscle mass and they lose muscle function. So it would be no surprise to know that they also lose some immune function. So strategies for preventing infectious diseases in older people are well worth looking at. And of course, the strategy for preventing infectious diseases in anybody that we're so familiar with is vaccine. And vaccination has had the greatest impact of any single health intervention. And therefore, we look to that for vaccinating at any age. But there's an issue there. Just looking again at infectious diseases in the elderly, there's a couple of slides which I thought drove home the message rather, and the reality of the situation, the relative mortality in older people compared to young adults. And this slide speaks to that very clearly. And again, this means that there's even greater benefit in preventing infectious diseases in older people than in younger adults. I'm not going to compare with children, as I said, because very young children clearly also have an immune system that's not yet mature and not yet fully functioning. This surprised me. So in the US, this particular paper looked at visits to the emergency room, to A&E, and more adults over the age of 65 visited an emergency department because of an infectious disease than for myocardial infarction and congestive heart failure combined. And I found that quite a surprising statistic. I think a few decades ago there was a beginning to feel that there's a feeling about that perhaps infectious diseases are becoming less important and we need more to worry about diseases to do with social behavior, to do with obesity, to do with nutrition and diet and so on. But clearly, and particularly for older people, infectious diseases remain a major threat to good health. So there's greater susceptibility, and older people are more likely to become infected. The disease tends to be more severe. There's more likely to be more serious sequelae, and this is very important because after a major infectious illness in an older person, particularly at the greater extremes of old age in the 80s and 90s, people are more likely to end up having to change their life, becoming more debilitated, less mobile, perhaps even moving into a care situation that they were not previously living in. So again, greater benefit of reducing the risk. But as well as the increased susceptibility to infectious diseases, of course, if the immune system is not functioning as in a younger adult, then it does not respond to vaccines in the same way either. And we've heard this throughout the day. It's been very, very nice to see the different threads coming together and looking at the information about flu vaccine and about the risk of flu and so on and so forth. So this has been identified as a priority. And it's interesting, there's surprisingly little known about the mechanism of immune senescence. But there's an enormous increase in interest. As the population ages, we're looking more and more at ways we can reduce the risk of infectious diseases and live into a healthy old age. So it's not just about the immune system per se, it's about physical aging, thinning of the skin, drier mucous membranes, reduced cough reflex, impaired bladder emptying, and these things get worse with age. Some of them start relatively early on. There's the comorbidities, neurovascular disease, stroke, which can impair the cough reflex and swallowing, and that makes it more likely, for example, to get aspiration pneumonia. There's reduced mobility. This all sounds incredibly depressing, and I apologise for that now, but it's a reality, and we all know it's a reality. There's more likelihood to be taking medication, which may relatively cause some degree of immune suppression in itself. There's changes in the microbiome, again, a relatively new subject in medicine and health that we're not really entirely familiar with yet, and we couldn't describe easily changes throughout life in the microbiome, apart from very large-scale, high-level changes. And that may be something that will be looked at both from an explanation for some of the effects of immune senescence, but also possibly as a therapeutic maneuver in the future. And of course, there's reduced immune competence or immune senescence. I think the very word senescence is a bit depressing as well, I must say. So here's a nice summary diagram looking at the decline in immune function. So lower vaccination, the point about this is it's multifactorial. It's not just simply your immune system doesn't work so well as it used to, but it has other effects too. So it decreased immune surveillance, in other words, looking for abnormalities within the individual, and it therefore gives rise to increased risk of cancers later in life. Decreased resistance to infections, greater susceptibility, increased onset of malignancies, increased inflammation, and I'll talk a bit more about this later. There's a term coined, which we hear nowadays, called Inflamm-ageing. Older people are in a state of chronic, mild inflammation, and that has various impacts on the way both the immune system works on the one hand and on, for example, autoimmune disease. Autoimmune activation occurs in later in life, and that seems paradoxical to me because we're saying that the immune system doesn't work as well as it did, but unfortunately it manages to work, as it were, better when it comes to causing autoimmune disease in later life. We're all quite familiar with looking at vaccine responses in older people, and we've heard quite a bit about that today. So this slide just looks at a particular study using Japanese encephalitis vaccine. And the purpose of this study was actually to look at the role of CMV infection in immune senescence. But this illustrates very well the story we're quite familiar with. So this is the response to vaccine in elderly people, and this in younger people. There's very much less response, and to the first dose, very, very little response indeed. And that's important, again, when you're looking at vaccines which require multiple doses, that protection after the first dose in a younger person, there is some real protection there, very, very little in an older person. And if you just look at this part of the diagram here, which looks at responders and the young versus the elderly, and again, something that we're familiar with, but it is very stark there. The situation really is such that protecting older people, and this also comes into travel vaccines, because more and more older people are travelling now and need protection from various conditions. And of course, Japanese encephalitis, as the name suggests, is something that might be used as a travel vaccine. And this well-known response in hepatitis B vaccine, and again, looking at this first part of the figure here, and the vertical lines are where the boosters take place, and what you're seeing there is again very, very little response to the very first dose. There is a response subsequently, but dramatically less than in younger people, and something to be aware of again if you're setting out to vaccinate older people. And older people are less likely to respond overall to hepatitis B vaccine. Very important if you're assuming that protection is in place once you've completed all 3 doses. The proportion of non-responders is much higher in older people. So now, having a look at immune senescence and the mechanisms, we're still learning a lot about this. As I say, there's a welcome burst of interest, which one hopes will be sustained in trying to explain exactly what's happening to the immune system in older people. And of course, if we understand it better, we may be able to use that information and that knowledge to develop ways of meeting the challenge of immune senescence in terms of vaccination and vaccination programs. So it's the response of the immune system to a lifetime surveillance and efforts against pathogens and persistent intrinsic and extrinsic challenges, i.e. the environment, chronic disease, and so forth. And again, it's just like, say, how your joints work. Your joints have had a lifetime of being used and being strained and stressed, and therefore they wear out. And like other systems, it affects all aspects of the immune system. So it's not one specific part of the immune system that ages disproportionately, although our knowledge to date suggests that some parts of the immune system are more affected than others. But the immune system as a whole ages, and that causes dysfunction. And I mentioned inflamm-ageing. So age-related immune dysfunction is coupled with this inflammatory state, and the two together bring about certain changes and clinical consequences: increased infections, cancers, autoimmune diseases. So there's a poor response to infection and a poor response to vaccination. Now, I'm not going to teach you all about the immune response. I'm not an immunologist at all. But what I did want to remind you was just this very simple diagram. So there's the innate immunity, and there's adaptive immunity, there's pathogens, there's a variety of cell types. These are antigen-presenting cells, these are macrophages, natural killer cells, neutrophils, and then the T and B cells. So a very simple schematic of immune response. And the reason I'm showing you that is because I want to just emphasize how the process of immune senescence affects every part of that cycle. And again, there's an awful lot of information here, and I'm going to summarize it with another helpful diagram, but it is worth just picking up on some of these particular issues. So the priming by antibody cells is reduced. So let's start, let's looking back to that diagram. So up here, these are these dendritic antigen-presenting cells. So starting there, they don't work so well. They are less able to take up and present antigen. Now, I'm not going to go into the mechanisms of any of these, partly because in many cases they're not yet clearly known. The naive B and T cells, so B cells which are going to produce antibodies, which are produced by the bone marrow, decrease. So all the hematopoietic cell lines are decreased. It's aging, less cell turnover, less new cell production. Elevated levels of tumor necrosis factor decrease the production of B cells and also the survival of plasma cells. and the reduction of IL-7, which is a cytokine that promotes the development of those T cells in the thymus, and also thymic involution, which we're all very familiar with and starts in childhood, result in a decrease in the peripheral naive T cells, the T cells ready there to react to a new pathogen. Antibodies tend to be of lower affinity due to reduced help by CD4 cells, T cells. I've already told you about IL-7. And you get expansion of T cell clones, which particularly occurs, going back to that study with Japanese encephalitis virus. That was looking at the immune response in older people who did or did not have CMV, cytomegalovirus. And the interesting issue there is that I think the paper was subtitled "Is Aging an Infectious Disease?" And it's a new and interesting area of research, but it does appear that there is a major impact of chronic viral diseases. So that could be Epstein-Barr, herpes virus, CMV, on the functioning of the immune system later in life. And it's because it's thought to be because the constant immune stimulation of these chronic viruses drives the terminal differentiation of T cells, so they're not then available, so they're all busy looking after chronic viruses and not being available as naive cells to respond to new pathogens. So this is just a summary, and again, I think it summarizes a lot of what I've said previously. Every aspect of both innate and adaptive immune system is affected by aging in a detrimental fashion. And here's just a summary of the effect of chronic viral infection. By the age of about 50, 60, about 70% of people will have CMV virus, chronic CMV virus. And therefore it's almost a natural and inevitable part of being a person of that age, with the response that the effect that affects the immune system and dysregulation of the immune system. Okay. And then just a few words about inflamm-ageing. So this again is thought to be closely associated with the impact of chronic viruses. The levels of interferon gamma contribute to the inflammatory process, as do levels of pro-inflammatory cytokines, and these increase with age. And this correlates with the development of chronic inflammatory diseases, but also it's correlated with more general effects of aging, such as frailty and general ill health. It increases per se, so the chronic inflammatory state increases the susceptibility to infectious diseases, and it also decreases vaccine response. Now, whether that could be a target in future for treatment or prevention is very debatable. As I say, if 70% of the population by the age of about 70 have CMV, it's a very difficult one to change. That would be a difficult area to affect. So I've been talking about immune senescence, and I just wanted to really say, when does all this happen? When does it kick in? Like all kinds of aging, it basically starts from very early on, from adulthood, if you like. So when are you old? When is old? And when it comes to deciding, when it comes to national vaccine schedules, old can be as early as 50 years old, and it may be as old as 65, 70. And the sorts of the vaccines that are recommended in these national schedules vary from country to country and minimum age to minimum age. So in the UK, I think we're all familiar with now the idea that it's 65 and over, and the vaccines recommended are pneumococcal vaccine, single dose, influenza, and shingles. And I know these have been discussed in some detail in previous talks. Can we overcome the challenge of immune senescence? Well, I was delighted to find that Amazon has already sorted this with this marvellous new supplement. It's not particularly expensive, considering, and it contains a variety of interesting substances, which I've never heard of personally. So apart from the fact that it's already sorted, it doesn't say when you should start taking these, but there are some challenges, needless to say. And given the impact and the power of vaccination in other age groups, and again, referring to the other talks we've heard today, I think there's a strong drive to try to produce good vaccines for older people. The starting point, I think, has to be making best use of existing vaccines. So maximising uptake. And in Richard's talk, he was showing that actually uptake of flu vaccine in older people is the group who's doing best, if you like. It's at around 72%, with a WHO goal of 75%. So the oldies are doing pretty well there, and they are taking these vaccines. But going back to what I was saying about the processes in the aging immune system, one of those is that as a person ages, the availability of naive T and B cells decreases. So that might just be an argument for this. What about priming earlier? We know that the older immune system can retain immune memory for a very, very long time. And one of the examples that's often given is the H1N1 outbreak, the swine flu, because in that particular year, the older people didn't do so badly because many of them had encountered at least an H1 before, and they retained the immune memory for that. So should we be actually lowering the age at which we consider people are old enough to need free flu vaccine, pneumococcal vaccine, and so on? And I think probably this should always be at the top. Maintain best possible general health. People who are frail, unwell, debilitated, also in parallel tend to have the least functional immune systems. And it's not really clear exactly where the chicken and the egg is there, apart from the obvious one that with everyone with age has a less functioning immune system. But general health is of vital importance. And it's boring old stuff like, eating properly, sleeping enough, getting plenty of exercise. It's really boring. But mostly it's stuff that we could encourage and we could do for ourselves. But you have to start early. It's no good deciding suddenly to become a runner at the age of 85 and hoping that that's going to save you and your immune system. We've also mentioned many times in previous talks about herd immunity and how it can have a major impact on the reduction of risk of infectious diseases in the elderly. They're pretty good, as I've already said, at getting their vaccines, but it also helps a lot if children are vaccinated as very good transmitters. As Richard said, they're quite snotty. They're I always think of them as being surrounded by this miasma of pathogens, and they walk around and transmit it to everybody else. That's because I'm not a paediatrician, I'm sure. That's a very unsympathetic view. But vaccinating children can have a major impact, both on them and on their grandparents. And Richard mentioned the age-segmented vaccination program. So we shouldn't think in terms of one vaccine for all or one program for all. Older people are different, just as I'm constantly told that pediatrics and children are different. Well, older people are different too. In a sense, they're a bit of a different species, in the same way that children are. We need to tailor vaccines to get optimum impact of the older immune system. We need more research. Very, very few vaccine studies are done specifically to look at the vaccine needs of older people. I think this will change. There's some very good reasons for that, but I think it'll change. I think going forward, as we have an increasingly ageing population, and we are aware of how effective vaccines are, that we're going to be looking more and more at specific research to produce vaccines specifically for older people. I hope so. And then looking at optimizing existing vaccines. We've talked earlier about increasing the dose of the antigen, and perhaps also looking into using alternative routes, intradermal particularly. There have been some very good studies where very good results have been seen with intradermal vaccines in older people. And there's also increasingly use of a nasal vaccine or nasal vaccines. Oh, this is just, I think Richard showed the same slide earlier. This is just to celebrate this lot. Very good. So what about developing new vaccines? As I said, there is an increasing amount of interest in this area, and the research needs to centre not just on can we produce a new vaccine for older people, but on understanding more about the ageing immune system and the social factors, the factors within communities that increase or decrease transmission of infectious diseases. So we need to understand immune decline better. Older people are less likely to mount a primary immune response to protein antigens, even at high dose. So looking at new vaccine adjuvants, and there has certainly been some research on that. And there's a adjuvant, the MF59, an oil in water immersion, but the oil is squalene rather than other oils, which in the past have caused problems with producing granulometer and other issues. That's already established. That's actually in a flu vaccine. There's also some very fancy immunological things, slightly over my head. One of the issues about the aging immune system is the way toll-like receptors no longer function as they did. And they could be used potentially as vaccine adjuvants. All these ideas are being looked at mainly at the moment in animal models rather than in humans. And cytokines, using cytokines in conjunction with vaccines such as IL-7 to increase T-cell survival, which could maintain a pool of naive T-cells, and that would allow a better response to novel antigens. And then there's the new antigens, such as conserved areas of surface proteins or internal viral proteins, viral vectors. There's a whole range of these. And as I say, many of them have reached the stage that they're being used in animal models at present. So there's quite a lot of vigorous research out there, but I expect there will be very much more. So, hopefully that as we all age, we will come into an era when there will be more effective vaccinations for older people, and we will understand better how the immune system ages and how we can meet the challenge of immune senescence. Thank you.